Get out of here, old man. This ain't your personal museum. The word sliced through the quiet hum of the library, sharp and venomous, spat by a young volunteer with a sneer that matched the fluorescent glare overhead. The small community library in Willow Creek, Ohio, smelled of dusty pages and polished wood, its shelves packed with stories of valor and sacrifice. But the air turned heavy, charged with the weight of those words, as they landed on 87-year-old James Jim Whitaker, a World War II veteran whose trembling hands clutched a worn copy of The Longest Day. Jim stood frozen, his weathered fingers gripping the book's spine, the creases of his face deepening with shock. The library, usually a haven of whispers and soft footsteps, felt like a battlefield now. The volunteer's voice a grenade lobbed at his dignity. Around him a handful of patrons glanced up from their tables, their eyes darting between curiosity and discomfort. The volunteer, a wiry kid in his early 20s with a name tag reading Tyler, leaned over the counter, his arms crossed, radiating impatience. His smirk was a silent dare, as if challenging Jim to respond. Jim's heart thudded, not from fear but from a familiar ache, a wound older than the shrapnel scar on his shoulder from Normandy. He'd come to the library that morning with a simple purpose: to find books on the Battle of the Bulge for a talk he'd promised to give at the local VFW post. It was a small act of service, one he'd done for years, sharing stories of his platoon with younger generations. His faded navy peacoat, adorned with a single bronze star pin, hung loosely on his thin frame, and his eyes, still sharp behind thick glasses, scanned the room for an ally. None came. The other patrons averted their gazes, burying themselves in their books or screens as if silence could erase the scene unfolding. "Sir, I just want to borrow these," Jim said, his voice steady but soft, the kind of calm forged in foxholes. He slid the book across the counter along with two others he'd carefully selected. His hands, spotted with age, moved deliberately as if to prove he wasn't shaken. But inside, a storm brewed. Memories of buddies lost, of nights spent shivering in the Ardennes, of a life spent proving his worth only to be dismissed by a kid who'd never known hardship. Tyler scoffed, flipping through the books with exaggerated disdain. "These are from the reserved section. You can't just waltz in and take what you want." His tone dripped with condescension, as if Jim were a child caught sneaking cookies. "Besides, why do you even need these? Nobody cares about that old war stuff anymore." The words hit like a slap and Jim's jaw tightened. He felt the weight of every year, every sacrifice, pressed down by the casual cruelty of someone who'd never seen a battlefield. The library's oak-paneled walls seemed to close in, the faint ticking of a clock amplifying the tension. Jim's gaze fell to a small, tarnished dog tag he wore around his neck, a memento of his best friend Eddie, who never made it back from Bastogne. He touched it, grounding himself, remembering why he was here. He wasn't just borrowing books. He was keeping Eddie's memory alive, keeping the truth of their sacrifice alive. But Tyler's words stung deeper than Jim expected, stirring a doubt he hadn't felt in years. Was it all for nothing? A murmur rippled through the room. An older woman at a nearby table coughed, her eyes flicking toward Jim with a mix of pity and unease. A teenager in the corner, earbuds dangling, recorded the exchange on his phone, his lips twitching with amusement. Jim noticed, and the shame crept in, hot and heavy like the summer heat outside. He wanted to explain about the war, about Eddie, about why these books mattered, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he straightened his spine, his military bearing kicking in, and said, "Son, I fought for the right to read those books." "Check them out, please." Tyler rolled his eyes, tossing the books onto a pile behind the counter. "Whatever, Grandpa. Wait here. I've got better things to do." He turned away, leaving Jim standing alone, the dog tag cold against his chest. The library's silence was deafening now, broken only by the rustle of pages and the distant hum of an air conditioner. Jim's mind raced, torn between the urge to walk away and the stubborn pride that had carried him through war. He wasn't just fighting for books. He was fighting for respect, for the memory of men like Eddie who deserved better than this. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps crunching on gravel grew louder, a subtle shift in the air that went unnoticed by most. Jim didn't hear it, but something in his gut told him this wasn't over. "Not yet. We've only just begun this story, but trust me, it's about to get even more intense." Stay with it to see what happens when Jim faces even greater injustice. The library's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on Jim Whitaker's weathered face as he stood at the counter, his hands still resting on the worn dog tag around his neck. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settles in your bones when you know you're being watched. Around him, the Willow Creek Library's patrons had settled into an uneasy hush, their eyes darting between Jim and the volunteer, Tyler, who was now rifling through a stack of papers behind the counter with exaggerated nonchalance. Jim's request for the WWII books, simple, earnest, rooted in a promise to honor his fallen brothers, had been met with a sneer, and now the sting of that disrespect was spreading like wildfire through his chest. Tyler glanced up, his lips curling into a half-smirk. "Look, old-timer, I checked the system. These books are flagged for a school project. You're not on the list." He leaned forward, his voice low and taunting as if daring Jim to argue. "Maybe try the senior center. They've got puzzles or something." A snicker escaped him, and it echoed in the quiet room, sharp as a blade. Jim's fingers tightened around the dog tag, the metal biting into his palm. He could almost hear Eddie's voice, rough and teasing, urging him to stand tall. "Don't let this punk get to you, Jimmy." But it wasn't just Tyler. The library itself seemed to conspire against him. A middle-aged woman in a cardigan shelving books nearby avoided Jim's gaze, her lips pressed into a thin line. A young man at a computer station coughed, then turned his screen away as if Jim's presence was an inconvenience. The teenager from earlier, still filming with his phone, whispered something to a friend, their laughter cutting through the silence like shrapnel. Jim's face burned, not with anger, but with a deeper, more insidious feeling, shame. He'd faced German tanks, dodged bullets in the snow, but this was a different kind of battlefield, one where his medals meant nothing. "I don't want trouble," Jim said, his voice low but firm, the cadence of a man who'd once commanded respect. "Those books aren't just for me. They're for a talk at the VFW. Kids need to hear about what happened, about the men who didn't come back." He gestured toward the stack of books. The Longest Day, Band of Brothers, a dog-eared history of the Battle of the Bulge, his eyes pleading for a shred of understanding. But Tyler just shrugged, tossing a pen onto the counter with a clatter. "Not my problem," Tyler said, turning to answer a phone that hadn't rung. The dismissal was so casual, so final, that Jim felt the ground shift beneath him. He glanced at the dog tag again, its edges worn smooth from years of touch, and remembered Eddie's last letter tucked away in his coat pocket. "Keep telling our story, Jimmy. Don't let him forget." That promise had kept Jim going through decades of pain, but now it felt like a weight he couldn't carry. The library door creaked open, letting in a gust of warm June air and the faint scent of gasoline from the parking lot. A group of high school students shuffled in, their backpacks slung low, their voices loud and carefree. One of them, a tall girl with braids, noticed Jim and hesitated, her eyes flickering with curiosity. But her friends pulled her toward a table, and the moment passed. Jim's shoulders sagged. He was invisible here, a relic in a world that had moved on. Then Tyler's voice cut through again, louder this time, as if performing for the new audience. "Hey, if you're gonna stand there, at least don't block the counter. Some of us have real work to do." He gestured toward a sign above the desk. "Respect our staff." The irony wasn't lost on Jim, and a bitter laugh escaped him before he could stop it. The sound drew eyes, patrons, students, even the woman shelving books, and for a moment, Jim felt exposed, raw, like a wound laid bare. "You think this is funny?" Tyler snapped, stepping out from behind the counter. He was taller than Jim, his frame lean but imposing, and he loomed over the older man with a confidence born of ignorance. "I'm trying to run a library here, and you're holding up the line." There was no line, just empty space and the weight of a dozen stairs. Jim's pulse quickened, his mind flashing to a frozen forest in 1944, to the moment he'd stared down a German sniper and lived. This kid was no sniper, but the threat felt just as real. "Son," Jim said, his voice steady but laced with steel, "I've earned the right to stand here, more than you'll ever know." He tapped the bronze star pin on his coat, a small gesture that carried the weight of a lifetime. Tyler's eyes flicked to the pin, then away, his smirk faltering for a split second before hardening again. "Yeah, well, that was a long time ago," Tyler said, crossing his arms. "Times change. Maybe you should too." The words landed like a punch, and Jim's breath caught. He wanted to shout, to tell this kid about the friends he'd buried, the nights he'd spent praying for dawn, the decades he'd spent teaching kids like Tyler about sacrifice. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he felt the dog tag against his chest, cold and heavy, anchoring him to a past that seemed to matter less with every passing second. The library's clock ticked louder, each second stretching into eternity. Outside, the crunch of gravel grew closer, a faint rhythm that no one else seemed to notice. The high school girl with braids glanced at Jim again, her expression softening, but she said nothing. The teenager with the phone zoomed in, his lens capturing every crease of Jim's pain. The woman in the cardigan hesitated, her hand hovering over a book she'd been about to shelve, as if considering whether to intervene. She didn't. Jim's hands trembled, not from age but from the effort to hold himself together. He looked at the books on the counter, then at the dog tag, then at the faces around him. Indifferent, curious, but none with fire. His chest tightened, and for the first time in years he felt small. But then he heard it. A single voice, soft but clear from the back of the room. "That's enough," it said, and the room froze as if the world had shifted gears. We're on the brink of something big. What happens next will turn everything upside down. You can't miss how this story explodes into its climax. The library's air hung thick, the silence shattered by that single commanding voice from the back of the room. That's enough. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of authority, slicing through the tension like a bayonet. Jim Whitaker, still gripping his dog tag, turned toward the sound, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and disbelief. The Willow Creek Library, with its musty books and flickering fluorescents, felt like a powder keg ready to blow. Every eye in the room, patrons, students, even the smug volunteer Tyler, snapped toward the source of the voice. A woman stood at the far end of the library, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her posture rigid as a general's. She wore a tailored blazer, a stack of books under one arm, and an expression that could stop a tank. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a local historian and professor, was a familiar face in Willow Creek, known for her lectures on the town's role in World War II. Her presence filled the room, and the faint scent of her lavender perfume cut through the stale air. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, each step deliberate, like a soldier advancing on a target. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice steady but laced with fire as she addressed Tyler. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" Tyler froze, his smirk fading as Eleanor's gaze pinned him like a specimen under glass. The teenager with the phone lowered it, his bravado replaced by uncertainty. The high school girl with braids, who'd been watching Jim with quiet sympathy, leaned forward, her eyes wide. The woman in the cardigan dropped a book, the thud echoing in the charged silence. Jim's chest tightened, not from shame now, but from the sudden shift in the room's energy. He stood straighter, his bronze star pin catching the light, a silent testament to his past. Eleanor's eyes met his, and for a moment he saw recognition, not just of him, but of the weight he carried, the battles etched into his soul. She didn't smile, but her nod was a salute, and it stirred something deep in Jim, a spark of the fire he'd thought had dimmed. Tyler stammered, his hands fumbling with the books on the counter. "I was just doing my job, ma'am. These books are reserved and he's not on the list." His voice cracked, the confidence drained from it. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a wry smile that held no warmth. "Your job," she said, "is to serve this community, not to belittle a man who fought for your freedom." That's James Whitaker, a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge. He's earned more respect in one day than you'll see in a lifetime. A murmur rippled through the room, a mix of gasps and whispers. The teenager's phone was back up, recording now with purpose, not mockery. The girl with braids stood, her voice trembling but clear. "He's right," she said, pointing at Jim. "My grandpa told me about guys like him. They saved the world." Her words, simple but fierce, hit like a rallying cry. The other students at her table nodded, their chatter turning to support, a chorus of agreement that swelled like a tide. Tyler's face reddened, his hands balling into fists. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered, but the excuse fell flat, drowned out by the growing hum of the crowd. Eleanor set her books down with a deliberate thud and walked to Jim's side, placing a hand on his shoulder. The touch was light, but it felt like an anchor, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Mr. Whitaker," she said loud enough for the room to hear, "I'd like to invite you to share your story. Right here, right now. These people need to hear it." Jim's throat tightened, his fingers brushing the dog tag. Eddie's tag, a reminder of promises kept. He hadn't spoken publicly in months, not since the VFW talk started feeling like shouting into the void. But Eleanor's voice, the girl's words, the crowd's sudden attention, it stirred something in him, a resolve forged in the frozen hell of Bastogne. He nodded, his voice hoarse but steady. "All right, I'll do it." Eleanor didn't waste a moment. She clapped her hands, her voice cutting through the room like a commander's order. "Everyone, gather around. We're having a reading, a real history lesson, from a man who lived it." Patrons stood, chairs scraping as they formed a semicircle near the library's central table. The woman in the cardigan, her eyes misty, helped clear space, her earlier hesitation replaced by purpose. The students crowded closer, their phones now capturing a moment of reverence, not ridicule. Jim took a deep breath, the weight of Eddie's dog tag steadying him. He pulled the folded letter from his coat pocket, its edges yellowed but intact, and began to read. "This is from my friend Eddie, written 2 days before he died in '44. His voice, rough at first, grew stronger with each word, painting a vivid picture of sacrifice, camaraderie, and loss. The room hung on every syllable, the air thick with emotion. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. A man in a flannel shirt, another veteran by the look of his cap, nodded silently, his jaw tight. The teenager stopped filming, his phone lowered, his face a mix of awe and guilt. Tyler stood frozen behind the counter, his earlier bravado gone. Eleanor shot him a look, not cruel but unyielding, and he shrank back, clutching the books he'd denied Jim. The crowd's energy shifted, their murmurs turning to applause as Jim finished, folding the letter with trembling hands. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice ringing out. This library will honor Mr. Whitaker's service with a permanent display of WWII stories, starting with his. And those books? They're his! No questions asked! The room erupted in cheers, a wave of sound that washed over Jim like a warm tide. The girl with braids approached, shyly offering a handshake. Thank you, she whispered, and Jim felt the ache in his chest ease, replaced by a quiet pride. He looked at the dog tag, then at the crowd, and for the first time that day he felt seen. As the applause faded, Eleanor pinned a small handwritten note to the library's bulletin board. In honor of James Whitaker, hero of Willow Creek. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a medal, a victory hard won. Jim touched the dog tag one last time, whispering to himself, "We did it, Eddie."